Hello everyone, I'm Brian LaRosa, and welcome back to LaRosa's Trains. This is my second video analysis of a Thomas the Tank Engine episode. My first video covered Henry's Forest and was uploaded in July of 2023. Today, I'm going to review another third series episode, number 20, titled Tender Engines. As some of you probably know, this year commemorates the 100th anniversary of Britain's most famous steam locomotive, the Flying Scotsman. A few months ago, I watched the Unlucky Tugs YouTube video documenting the engine's visit to the United States, and shortly after, I bought a special DVD set covering the complete history of this irreplaceable railway treasure. So come along and learn how the Flying Scotsman became the basis for a visiting character in both the Railway series and Thomas and Friends. Without further ado, you're watching the analysis of Tender Engines. The story begins with Gordon, the big express engine, who often requires large amounts of coal and water. James, the red engine, criticized Gordon for his greed, but the latter claimed that important engines need plenty of coal. Then, when he took on water from a temporary standpipe, Duck, the Great Western engine, showed up and told him that too much water could cause a boiler rake. This made Gordon cross. He told Duck that big engines have large necessities and that little engines are rather irritating. As Gordon steamed into the yards, he was amazed to see two shiny green tenders. Although they belonged to a visitor, he believed that a double tender means less frequent stops and no more listening to little engines. Just then, Diesel arrived and ominously informed Gordon that diesels were going to replace steam, thus requiring no tenders of any sort. Gordon was very depressed. The next day, he was still in a bad mood. Duck suggested that it must be a boiler rake. Before Gordon could explain his issue, Henry the green engine went on teasing him. Insulted, the big blue engine had enough and coupled up to his coaches waiting at the station. After hearing Gordon's concerns about his career, Sir Topham Hatt promised that the diesel takeover would never happen on his railway. He also explained that the visitor lives on a railway with long distances between coaling depots, which is the reason he had two tenders. Gordon smiled and puffed away with his train. However, Henry was unhappy and was so overworked that he desired an additional tender. With a little help from Donald, the Scottish engine, Duck decided to make a prank on Henry. Duck asked the big green engine whether he was interested in his tenders, and I mean Duck's. Henry was confused, considering that Duck was only a tank engine. Then Donald was asked if he was interested. Before Duck could offer his tenders to James, Henry quickly apologized for his rudeness and asked how many tenders were available and when to pick them up. The answer was 6 of them, much to Henry's excitement. By the end of the day, all the tenders were ready, and the other engines wanted to watch Henry pull them. But he turned out to be an awful sight because the 6 tenders were very old, dirty, and filled with boiler sludge. At that moment, Henry heard a voice calling out the same joke he had said earlier. It was believed to have come from Gordon. So there you have it, the plot summary of Tender Engines. Let's discuss the essential details that make up this episode. The Flying Scotsman was built by the Doncaster Works in 1923 as part of the 462 A1 Pacific class for the London and North Eastern Railway LNER. The steam locomotive was named after a train that served between King's Cross Station in London, England, and Waverley Station in Edinburgh, Scotland. It was also officially the first British locomotive to reach its speed of 100 miles per hour. My first exposure to the Scotsman was from a VHS tape titled Confessions of a Train Spotter, documented in 1980 by Monty Python actor Michael Palin. He took a lot of different trains from his home in London via Euston Station to a northwestern Scottish coastal town called Kyle of Lacalsh. During his trip, Palin rode on the Flying Scotsman between Manchester and York. When I was very young, I used to think that the locomotive looked much like Henry because of its apple green paint scheme. However, it was actually built to the same specifications as Gordon because he is classified as an A1, created by a Scottish-born designer, Sir Nigel Gresley. Gresley also designed a streamlined steam locomotive class called the A4, including Mallard, and a fictional character named Spencer. The Flying Scotsman first appeared as a Thomas character in a Railway Series book titled Enterprising Engines by Wilbert Awdry. This book was published in 1968, 5 years after the real locomotive was retired by British Rail, but thankfully rescued by Alan Pegler. In the Railway Series story, Tenders for Henry, the Scotsman is portrayed as Gordon's only surviving brother, but in the 1992 TV episode, he turned out to be a stranger instead. This character was initially about to play a bigger role, but unfortunately, the engine portion was too expensive to build during the model series, so only his tenders were made. If you look carefully at this view, there's a cab section of the locomotive behind the two tenders. That actually came from the Henry prop, since he was painted in the same tone of green as the Scotsman. After the filming of Tender Engines, there was no plan to reinstate the Flying Scotsman in a later episode until the computer-generated imagery CGI series came out in 2008. Interestingly, there has been a face design for the Scotsman. It essentially resembles Gordon's, but accented with some unique facial features. Alternatively, the filmmakers could have built this engine with a faceless smokebox door, like they did for the City of Truro locomotive, aka a celebrity in a third series episode, Gordon and the Famous Visitor. Oddly enough, the City of Truro, built in 1903, was claimed to have reached 100 miles an hour, 20 years before the Flying Scotsman's existence. According to an archived BBC Radio 4 webpage, the Scotsman achieved its genuine 100-mile-per-hour speed record on November 30th, 1934, as verified by an attached dynamometer car. While this locomotive made only one model series appearance in Thomas & Friends, he did join the merchandising world of the popular franchise. For example, there's a Thomas Wooden Railway model based on the Railway Series version of him. Since I used to play with my wooden trains as a kid, I honestly regret that I did not add him to my collection, if you ask me. The Flying Scotsman made his first full on-screen appearance in a 2016 direct-to-home video CGI movie titled The Great Race. He then appeared in a few other productions afterwards. I'm not going to cover all the details of his CGI form because I personally don't care much about that era. It would have been more fun if the Scotsman was fully introduced in the model series, but there's no denying that the real engine is a very precious piece of British history for train spotters like me. Let's move on to some other elements that make Tender Engines an interesting episode. Tender Engines isn't the first Thomas episode talking about tenders. The subject has been initially mentioned in a Series 1 story, Tenders and Turntables. Mainline engines like Gordon are intended to move forwards for safety, while small tank engines like Thomas can move forwards or backwards without any problems, ideal for shunting. A turntable is provided to prevent the big engines from running dangerously in reverse on the main line. But one day, a strong gust of wind, combined with Gordon's bad mood, caused him to be improperly positioned onto the turntable. The workmen failed to turn the big engine around, and Gordon was forced to pull his next train slowly in reverse. It's not unrealistic to see a tender locomotive pulling a train backwards. If the tender's height is lower than the cab, then it is more than okay to proceed in reverse, because it does provide a better visibility to the crew. And also, if a turntable is absent on a particular railway line. For steam locomotives, separate tenders offer large amounts of coal and water while permitting the engines to negotiate tight curves. Tank engines, on the other hand, have coal bunkers that are permanently fixed behind the cab, but they can only carry small amounts of coal and water. If a bunker were enlarged for extra capacity, it can make a locomotive too long and therefore too difficult to run on curves. That's why a separate tender is coupled behind the engine. The more coal and water available, the more efficiently the locomotive can perform over long distances. And what about double tenders, like the ones behind the Flying Scotsman? As you can see, both of them appear to contain coal and water, but the real locomotive's second tender only has water, so there's no coal seen on top. I honestly have no idea why an auxiliary tender has just water and not coal, but if somebody knows the answer, please leave me a comment below. The 6 old tenders pulled by Henry are modeled after an LNER 4200 gallon type, and most have the NE initials as if they retain their black paint from the Second World War. In the next episode, Escape, which comes right after tender engines, they are seen again as shunted by diesel. Since then, the old tenders were repurposed as scrap props in later episodes throughout the classic series. Even the Flying Scotsman's tenders were also reused as scrap models. However, in a Series 8 episode, Halloween, one of the old tenders was coupled behind an A-Class Pacific for a minor role as the Halloween engine. Notice the tail lamp on the rear. With everything explained, the theme suggests that tenders are one of the things that make big steam locomotives feel important on the island of Sodor, and they often brag about their size and superiority. As for diesels, they don't need separate tenders to carry diesel fuel because it is stored in a fuel tank fixed to the body, typically under the locomotive chassis. That pretty much sums up the episode's theme, so the next chapter we'll cover is the tone and music of tender engines. From a big engine's point of view, the tone may be about pride and supremacy, but for others, there's also some humor since Duck was willing to play a trick on Henry. Even before that, Henry told Gordon that the latter's boiler could be full of sludge, and Gordon said, "Don't be vulgar." Imagine this as an adult joke, if sludge is a reference to a swear word that means sewage or something like that. The humor is certainly not complete without the ending scene where Henry pulls the 6 old tenders full of sludge. As mentioned before, he heard the mysterious voice saying, "Had a good washout, Henry. That's right, you'll feel a different engine now." I'm sure many of you Thomas fans agree that it did come from Gordon, but some others may think it's just lazy writing, as if it's forcing viewers to guess who spoke up. Well, the writing's not stupid, but it is deliberately persuading the audience to assume that it was Gordon. His voice is relatively easy to identify in both the UK and US narrations by Michael Angelis and George Carlin, respectively. While Gordon isn't directly mentioned as the ending voice, we can just use some context clues, and chances are he is the correct voice. When it comes to music, much of the score is pretty generic in this episode, but there are a couple of noteworthy pieces that come to mind. First, There's a unique version of Henry's theme that is only heard in tender engines, and it is played when he was excited about the 6 tenders. This variation is in the key of G major, for those of you who are musically inclined. The other notable score occurs shortly after Henry's theme, and, according to a YouTube channel, Mavis M, is called Grumpy Gordon. It was first used in a Series 3 episode, The Trouble with Mud, where Gordon was being washed. So this particular score would be provided to complement the comedic tone of Tender Engines. Unfortunately, I can't play any of the music in this video for copyright reasons, but you can find these tracks from other channels like Mavis M. This person did a splendid job of remaking the scores used throughout the classic series of Thomas and Friends. So, these are the major details that make this episode pretty funny. I first watched Tender Engines in a British VHS tape, Escape and Other Stories, with Michael Angelis as the narrator. I also have 2 American releases containing George Carlin's dub of the same episode, Best of Gordon and Percy Takes the Plunge. The latter is essentially a DVD reissue of Daisy and other Thomas stories. Strangely, Tender Engines is the only 1990s era 3rd series episode in this release, because the rest are from the 1st and 2nd series, both of which debuted in the 80s. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed learning the connection between the Flying Scotsman and the Thomas franchise. I have a couple of closing notes before I end this video. First of all, I received something very special from Brian and Liz Argyle, who both lived in England and are friends of my parents. In fact, I was named after that guy on the day I was born. They sent me a very thoughtful letter and a collection of Royal Mail stamps commemorating the centennial of the Flying Scotsman. Mr. and Mrs. Argyle, if you're watching this video, thank you so much for the stamps. They look very beautiful indeed. And 2, if you'd like to support La Rosa's Trains, I would greatly appreciate it. That can be done through my Patreon page at patreon.com/LaRosasTrains. Patrons will receive special benefits, which are all explained on this page. Link in the description. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. This is Brian La Rosa signing off, and I will see you next time.